We're talking with Professor Monte Brown of the philosophy department about his new book, Reason, Revelation, and Metaphysics, the Transcendental Analogies, which was published in 2020 on Catholic University Press. How the book came to be, how your idea for it started, and what was its genesis.
Right. Well, I've always been interested in big ideas. So my dissertation was on permanent creation in Aquinas. So I like these systematic questions. And most of my writing has dealt with the relationship between faith and reason along the way. So this was my latest attempt to bring it all together as I could, reason, revelation, and metaphysics, and the transcendental analogies. Inspired by the work of, well, really Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Aquinas, that tradition, and then to some degree by a theologian, Donald Keefe, who very brilliant on this relationship between faith and reason and why it makes a difference that we include revelation in our thinking. So it's been a long process coming. This is sort of my biggest work, so hopefully it's...
So the subtitle of the book is The Transcendental Analogies. Can you tell us what those are and how they fit into the book?
Yes. Well, it kind of melds together two big metaphysical topics, the transcendentals and analogy. So the transcendentals are those characteristics that apparently can be, or at least seem to be, applicable to all things, including mysteriously God, which is an interesting relationship. So being, unity, truth, goodness, and beauty. Those are the basic ones. I mean, some people add one or two others, but those are the ones that I think are most compelling. And so the question is, if they belong to all things can say to be, to exist, and to be one, and to be true, good, and beautiful, but slightly different ways, then that raises questions for us. So the traditional proof for the existence of God coming out of Plato, it's in Aristotle, it's Aquinas' fourth way, it's in Augustine, it's in Anselm. It's this idea if they're more or less good or beautiful or true or things that exist more or less, there must be some kind of ultimate standard. That's how we get the notion of God. But then what's the relationship between God and these transcendental qualities? And this is where the question of analogy comes in. Because if we talk about God and creatures, we're not going to talk about them exactly the same way, univocal way, but they are related. Otherwise, we couldn't argue from creatures to the Creator. So we have to do it in some kind of analogical way, particularly when we're talking about these fundamental goods, the good of the transcendentals. Aquinas will say, by analogy, and here he follows Aristotle, that in things that are related analogically, one of them is the prime meaning. Here he's following Aristotle. Aristotle gives this example of healthy. You can talk about an animal being healthy, medicine being healthy, and urine being healthy, but there's a prime meaning that enters into the definitions of the others. So if we want to know of those three things, what's the most important thing to understand? It's what a healthy animal is, because that's why we want this medicine, because it makes the animal healthy, and the urine is a sign of that. So this idea of a prime analogy, it seems to me to be the fundamental, or the most interesting at least, idea of analogy. There are different ones too that people have talked about, but I think that's really fascinating. And when Aquinas talks about these transcendentals, he's going to argue that the prime analogy is God. So if we're talking about goodness, it exists most perfectly in God, and most really in God, and in a secondary way in creatures. This raises an interesting question for philosophy. Aquinas starts off, his first question of assume is about faith and reason, clearly indicating that we have to have faith and all that. But then he basically takes the realm of philosophy, the way of philosophy for a while. But here's one of the difficulties, tricky passages, is that he says, if we're talking about the relationship between God and creatures, which is what analogy is about, then creatures are really related to God because they depend on God, but God is not really related to creatures. So if, as Aquinas says, the prime analogate for the transcendentals is God, but we don't know anything about God by reason, then how is that going to help us understand the world? This is where I think the idea of revelation comes in. Because revelation says from the get-go, God is really related to creatures in creation, and obviously in Christ and in the church and all that. So those fundamental understandings, the prime articles of the faith, just two of them to put on the table now, the Trinity and the Incarnation, do have content, and I think they help us understand the world, or at least they keep our quest for understanding the world alive, which is kind of wonderful. So just a couple of quick examples, and then we'll get back to other questions you might have about this. So if we take the question of the Trinity, most obviously that is a good paradigm for community, because we say that God is not an absolute, like a tyrant over the creation. God is a trinity of persons in relation. And so clearly, if we're looking for the best kind of community, we want one that's freely related, where people are freely related. And it seems that it also spills off into other areas. Whitehead is famous for saying that a lot of science grows out of medieval theology, that theology asks us questions that go beyond any systematic way we have explaining things and lead us to think of reality in certain relational terms. So this paradigm of the Trinity as God as a Trinity is more helpful for keeping open our quest for understanding community, and even for understanding the scientific way we understand the scientific method and how we understand the world that way. And then if we just take for a second the Incarnation, which is they're both huge mysteries, man is God in Jesus. So nothing human is to be left out, because, and the depth of what we have to do to honor humanity is deeper than we can ever fulfill. So that, again, helps us understand, if you like, the metaphysics or anthropology of what a human being is, but also our obligations to human beings. Yeah. So there's a way in which I think faith really helps us keep on the track of seeking the truth about reality and ourselves.
Yeah. So here at St. Anselm, a part of our mission is understanding how faith can add to our understanding of things, and seeing the relationship between faith and reason. How do you think that the thesis and the insights in this book can contribute to perhaps to your teaching or to the way in which we as a community try to fulfill those goals?
Right. Well, I think, very specifically, I teach a course on the Catholic intellectual tradition, so it feeds right into that, because that's kind of what it's about. But I think just generally for the mission of our college as a whole, one thing that Socrates is famous for is saying that I don't understand everything. And I think that's right about authentic philosophy. It's certainly right about the faith. We have these mysteries at the heart of our faith, mysteries that I think are increase our understanding and give more depth to our understanding of what it is to be human, what it is to be in the world, and what it is to have a world that's a free creation, not a necessary structure. So I think really, obviously it's quite close to what I teach in my courses in philosophy. It's close in theology, but I think it also spills over to the understanding of the world by science and languages and all this stuff. The human is infinitely valuable and important.
You said that St. Thomas argued for the priority of one of the transcendentals. Do you agree with him? Do you have a favorite transcendental?
Well, St. Thomas would certainly say that, following Aristotle, that is the being is the critical one. What I argue in this book is interesting is, I think that's where you start, and this is a book on metaphysics, so being has a kind of primacy here. But it seems to me that to be open to the fully human and to the way the world is, one has to be open to the distinction between them. So there could be a priority in a way of being, but it can't be absolute, because the first principles of what makes good things good and makes things beautiful are not reducible completely to being, even though we're trying to express it in terms of metaphysics. And that a metaphysics that doesn't include room for genuine ethics, for the freedom that's necessary there, that has to be part of it, or there is no ethics, or one that doesn't appreciate beauty in its own right, would be defective. So I love all of them. I think they all contribute something to our understanding. And that's why I call it about the transcendental analogies, because I don't think they're all reducible to one, even though some people have argued for that. And I suppose Aquinas following Aristotle does in one place. But it seems to me that we have to keep the distinction alive between the good, the beautiful, and the true.
In your own life, has the reason come before the faith and led you to faith, or has there always been a foundation of faith that led you to this understanding the limitations of reason?
That's a good question, man. I grew up in a Christian family, so it was there in a way. But my way to the Catholic faith was the intellectual route, I think I'd say. I had a lot of questions. And I just started reading, well, really Plato and Aristotle, interesting enough, the good old pagans. But then that led me to Augustine and Aquinas and Anselm and this whole tradition. So I had a lot of questions. And it seems to me that philosophy can answer a lot of them, but it leads us to the threshold of something more always. And it seems to me that the faith keeps that intellectual life alive. And that's why, grateful to teach at a Catholic college where we can talk about this relation between faith and reason.
And how did you encounter the work of Keith, who you mentioned, and what influence did that have?
Yes, well, Kevin McMahon of our theology department did his PhD under Keith. And then 1 year, probably 10 or 15 years ago, we tried to have at least a study group reading parts of Keith. But Keith is very difficult. I mean, he's brilliant, I think. I really do think he's one of the most brilliant theologians, and as a result, a philosopher as well, that I know, but very difficult. So what I did is I knew something was good here I wanted to study, so I took a sabbatical and read his covenantal theology straight through. And by the time you do that, you begin to catch on. So I come introduced by Kevin McMahon, and then I happily had a chance to talk with Father Keith on a number of occasions. We used to visit him once or twice a year down in New York. So I think his idea is this, and now I'm a philosopher basically, that I love the faith. He's a theologian, and he's going to argue that to really do theology as we should do it in his mind, then you've got to keep the strictly theological points at the center, which would be the Incarnation, the Trinity, and the Eucharist. Rather than trying to explain that by something else, take those and have them help explain the rest of reality in a way, shedding light on the rest of reality.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anything else that you think that we should talk about or you'd like to say? We've got to probably have enough. But
I think that's good. I mean, I just, again, as I say, the book comes out of, and my take on this is influenced by Keith, but again, I'm working on what is it that someone like a philosopher, someone just with questions and reason, how do we come to understand this? And it seems to me the way in and away from philosophy is our understanding of our own freedom. And somehow that can't be compromised. So, whether it's, you think, from below, from evolution or matter and motion, we're determined, or from above, from God. It can't be true. Somehow this freedom keeps alive our understanding of what an adequate relationship would be between each other and also with us and God. And that's also revealed in Scripture. So I think they balance each other off.
Yeah.